Otherwise, this is one of those kind of scenes that constitutes the don't in the fire protection regulations. So, if you're all horribly burned, don't think about getting a lawyer. Okay. It's very obviously a great pleasure for all of us and for all of you that Peter's agreed to come and give a talk here. He's going to speak on kind of architecture and the Situationist movement. Peter has for a long time kind of written on film and made a number of films and is now a professor of film at UCLA while continuing to write and indeed to not only write on Situationist movement but to have organized the exhibition which was at the Pompidou and then I think it was at the ICA, the same one at the ICA, which you may recall. His most recent books include Raiding the Icebox, Singing in the Rain, and Visual Display, and indeed the one I was reading this afternoon on crime, the exhibition Scene of the Crime. It's, as I say, a very great pleasure to welcome him here this evening. Thank you.
Okay, it's just as well that there are no slides, but I'm not showing any as a blow against the spectacle. Is that okay? This lecture is dedicated to Kathy Acker. The Situationists and Architecture. This is not really a conventional lecture. Instead, I'm going to talk about a number of topics addressed by the Situationists, making in the end a kind of collage of commentaries on what seem to me key elements of their thought, which bear a relation to architecture and the city, which were indeed centrally important topics for them. These elements are going to be as follows. 1, the minaret. 2, the gypsy camp. 3, Dérive. 4, Mad King Ludwig. 5, the postman Cheval. 6, the Merzbau. 7, Le Corbusier. 8, Paris. 9, Psychogeography. 10, Love on the Left Bank. 11, White Bicycles. 12, New Babylon. 13, The Cavern of Antimatter. 14, Watts. 15, The Architecture of Despair. 16, Détournement. 17, Vienna's Place. And finally, 18, Albisola. I begin with the minaret. In 1948, Asger Jorn, who was with Guy Debord one of the two major influences and important figures in the Situationist movement, Asger Jorn wrote an article titled "What is an Ornament?", which was published in an obscure Danish journal. That same year, he had spent some time in Djerba, Tunisia, which I believe may be the same place that Paul Klee had visited, and which had had an influence on his calligraphic style of drawing, or maybe that was Kairouan. Among the illustrations to Jorn's essay was one which juxtaposed an image of a horsetail and a minaret. The horsetail is a kind of plant whose structure is very similar to that of the minaret depicted next to it. A kind of telescopic series of towers, each with a narrower diameter than the last, piled on top of each other, finally ending with a tiny little turret at the topmost point. The picture of the horsetail used looks as if it was one of Blosfeldt's famous series of photographs of plants, but I haven't had the time or the energy to check this. The point Jorn wishes to make is summed up in his caption, quote, "Horsetail and minaret, they resemble each other, not because the minaret is a copy of a plant, but because this is the natural mode of form in matter." Underneath, there is a similar juxtaposition of a totem pole and a chestnut branch, also lookalikes. Jorn observes that the nature of art is not to imitate the external forms of nature, naturalism, but to create natural art. Natural sculpture, which is true to its material, will be identical to nature's forms without seeking to imitate. Architecture and sculpture, I might note, here seem to be treated as if they were more or less the same thing. Asger Jorn had gone to Djerba in order to confirm the theories put forward by the Swedish architectural theorist Erik Lundberg. According to Jorn, writing in the late 1940s, Erik Lundberg seems to me the first in the civilized world, America included, who has been able to give a definition of the opposition between the classical European and the Oriental attitudes to art, which is correct, true to reality, and which offers a perspective for explaining works of art and their nature. For Jorn, the pairing of European versus Oriental ran together with other pairings, such as classical versus spontaneous, idealist versus materialist, Apollonian versus Dionysiac, etc., with Jorn supporting the second term throughout, Oriental, materialist, spontaneous, Dionysian, and so on. Obviously, these pairings are very broad brush in their scope, but they gave Jorn a framework for developing his ideas about art and architecture, ideas which had a big effect on situationist thought, as we shall see. Next, the Gypsy Camp. Another early member of the Situationist group, back in its Imaginist Bauhaus days, was Giuseppe Pino Galizio, an Italian artist. Pino Galizio had played an important role in his hometown in northern Italy, defending the rights of gypsies to set up campsites. This defense of nomadism became an important element in situationist thought. The Belgian artist Constant, another early situationist, designed a gypsy camp as an architectural project, creating a sketch and a maquette, an architectural complex which could be taken apart, transported, and reassembled. After the Situationist International had been dissolved, de Boer's partner, Alice Becker-Ho, wrote a fascinating little book on the Romany language. There is an obvious sense in which this abiding interest in nomads and gypsies could also be related to Jorn's support for the spontaneous and the Dionysian over the classical and the Apollonian. To be fixed, to be static, is to refuse spontaneous activity, to remain, in a sense, imprisoned in a single confining location. In fact, Constant, as we shall see, designed his city project, New Babylon, to be inhabited only by transients, rather than having a settled population. In a way, it was rather like a single city-scale mega hotel complex. Now Dérive. Guy Debord wrote the classic text on the theory of the dérive, usually translated drift or drifting, in December 1958, in the second number of International Situationist. He defines it as, quote, a technique of transient passage through varied ambiances. Note again the taste for transience and spontaneity. Debord's basic idea is that this project of wandering through the city should be determined not by any preconceived plan, but by the attractions or discouraging counter-attractions of the city itself. It requires a letting go of the usual motives for movement and action. We might almost say a letting go of everyday identity. Debord seems to have been inspired in part by Chambard de Love's study of Paris and the Parisian agglomeration, published in 1952, particularly by its detailed maps, often historical maps, which are frequently used as illustrations in the Situationist Journal and in Debord's own artworks. He was struck in particular by a map detailing all the movements made over a single year by one student living in the 16th arrondissement. Quote, her itinerary delineates a small triangle with no deviations, the three apexes of which are the School of Political Science, her residence, and that of her piano teacher. Shocked by this rigid repetition of a fixed pattern of mobility, Debord conceived Dérive as a way of creating completely new, unpredictable itineraries, dependent on chance and the spontaneously subjective impulses and reactions of the wanderer. The recourse to chance reminds us unavoidably of André Breton's doctrine of objective chance, and especially of his great surrealist book, Nadia, which traces a series of just such aimless journeys through Paris, punctuated by a pattern of attraction and repulsion to and from certain buildings or kinds of buildings rather than others. Debord notes that this technique of dérive is in a way only necessary because his larger project of psychogeography had not yet been sufficiently far developed. Psychogeography would make possible the creation of new kinds of map in which particular locations or regions had already been designated as favoring the arousal of one kind or other of affective or aesthetic response, so that a certain amount of pre-planning could then take place. Meanwhile, chance was the best method. This text, interestingly enough, was written just as John Cage was conducting his seminars on chance procedures in New York at the School for Social Research. Probably a lucky coincidence. A dérive could take place over a few minutes or even a few days. Duration didn't matter. Taxis could be used for rapid transport outside one's usual environment. One situationist demand was for the abolition of private cars and their replacement by fleets of low-cost taxis. As in Breton's book, the dérive also implied the possibility of chance encounters, meetings with strangers. Debord even suggests that the subject of a dérive might be invited to visit a particular place at a particular time with the expectation of meeting some unknown person, thus being forced to introduce her or himself to random passers-by in an effort to identify if they were the person he or she was looking for. This was called the technique of the, quote, possible rendezvous. He also reveals a taste for wandering in uncanny locations, quote, slipping by night into houses due for demolition, wandering in subterranean catacombs forbidden to the public, etc. Here we see the dérive both as a kind of dream journey, even an invitation to break taboos, or perhaps simply to enjoy what we might think of in the architectural register as the Gothic picturesque. Fourth, Mad King Ludwig. King Ludwig of Bavaria, as I'm sure many of you know, built the palaces at Neuschwanstein, Herrenchiemsee, and Linderhof. Strange follies, in a way the Gothic picturesque, perched high in the mountains with an architectural repertory ranging from fairy tale turrets through to the Wagnerian grotto. The Mad King's follies appealed to the Situationists, presumably because they defied the protocols of instrumental reason. The king built exactly what he desired in the way he wanted it, rather as if he was engaged in a kind of constructional or architectural dérive. The idea of the folly seems crucial to Situationist thinking on architecture, just as it was to the Surrealists. In a way, though, folly is slightly too weak a word, conjuring up as it does Stowe or Stourhead, monuments of the English 18th century picturesque. Probably a better term would be outsider architecture. On the other hand, a builder like Gaudi in Barcelona was a professional architect, despite the idiosyncrasy of his work. Niki de Saint-Phal, who has built a whole series of strange houses in France and Italy, is a professional artist. Perhaps the main point is that all these buildings seem to meld sculpture with architecture and to be works of the untrammeled imagination rather than the controlling reason. In the pre-Situationist journal Potlatch, King Ludwig was invoked alongside Claude Lorrain, Piranesi, and the postman Cheval as pioneers of psychogeography. Perhaps the building most mentioned by the Situationists was the Palais Idéal of the postman Cheval, another great surrealist favourite, which is to be found in a small village near Lyon. A photograph of Debord at the Palais Idéal can be found at the museum at Silkeborg in Denmark. Instigated by a dream, based perhaps on memories of a mock Asian palace seen at an exhibition in Paris, the Palais Idéal falls into the category of highly ornamented buildings approved by Jorn, with a quasi-organic feel to them, as if they had grown out of the rock rather than been carefully planned and constructed by their obsessive artisanal creator. Moreover, there are abundant references in the few remarks which Cheval left behind him to North African architecture, in his descriptions of the palace, to an Arabian mosque, an Arabian house, and construction in the Egyptian style, according to Cheval himself. It's important, too, that Cheval, like Constant or Pino Galizio, or indeed Ludwig of Bavaria, was not a trained architect working to a commission, but a visionary willing to devote his life to realizing his personal dream. Although we might think of him as a crazed, compulsive obsessive, from another vantage point, he could be described as an entirely free man, whose life outside his work as a postman was devoted solely to his great imaginative project. In fact, even his hours as a postman were devoted partially to the task. He kept a lookout all the time for useful chunks of rock, the soft limestone of the region, as he cycled down the country lanes with his mailbag, stopping to place chunks of rock at the side of the road to be collected later in the day after work in his cart for use in the building. Kurt Schwitters's Merzbau in Hanover, which I revisited a month or so ago, is, so to speak, the practicing artist's version of outsider art, a single room densely packed with the signs and symbols of an intensely private imaginative world. On the other hand, it also appears relatively orderly and sophisticated, with a clear sense of geometrical design and carefully contrived focal points for the eye. For the artists who made up the bulk of the Situationist group, particularly in its early years, Schwitters was a more appropriate role model, perhaps, than either the crazy authoritarian king, who was, after all, a king, with his apparently unlimited resources, or the strange, unsophisticated postman with his single compulsive life's project. Schwitters was well aware of what he was doing and why, even as he was prepared to use elements of chance or to follow a sudden impulse. The scale of his work, too, was much less grandiose, almost domestic. It's not that the Situationists didn't have their own megalomaniac side. It's more that their truly grand public visions of constructing whole new revolutionary cities were much more ambitious than those even of outsider artists, while their private projects, films, installations, architectural models, sculptures, etc., were actually quite feasible. The counterpart of the Situationists' praise for Schwitters can be found in their hatred of Le Corbusier and modern rationalist architecture in general. In some sense, too, Corbusier could be seen as a rival with his own megalomaniac city plans, devised, however, on a very different intellectual basis. The dislike for Le Corbusier can be found very early on in Jorn's writings. Jorn had studied painting as a young man with Fernand Léger, and had actually worked at that time, while he was a student, on a painting decoration project under Le Corbusier's direction. In the words of the most acute commentator on Jorn's thinking, Graham Birtwistle, these experiments made a deep impression on him, stimulating both an antipathy to the kind of theory and practice he had encouraged in Paris, and a lasting respect for Léger and Le Corbusier, whom Jorn apparently went on to regard as the most noble of foes. Jorn's repeated polemic against Corbusier was mainly directed at his functionalism, what Jorn saw as his reductive vision of architecture as a means to an end, rather than an end in itself. It was precisely because he was searching for a way of mounting a powerful critique of Corbusier, so it seems, that Jorn turned to the work of Erik Lundquist with such interest and enthusiasm. Essentially, he set himself the life's task, never actually completed, of constructing a counter-theory to that of Le Corbusier. One of Debord's main arguments against capitalism was contained in his film Critique of Separation, released in 1961, with its call for an attack on the totality of society, because only a total revolution could overthrow the separation of subject and object which capitalism entailed. Jorn, somewhat earlier, had developed his own critique of separation, but in a different context, the critique of Le Corbusier. Quote, "The logical functionalists saw a value in the division of architectural elements into supporting, isolating, and enclosing elements, just as they attempted to divide the towns into districts for families with children, districts for the elderly, for students, artists, etc. It's even claimed that it's natural, as if the functions of life allow themselves to be split off from one another. Is it, for example, the human skeleton which supports the muscular system, or do the muscles support the skeleton? Is it the stalk, or is it the sap, which is the supporting principle in a tulip? Can a skeleton stand without muscles? Can muscles hold a skeleton up without blood? Can a tulip stand up without help from its sap?" As Birtwistle observes, Jorn's polemical point is clear. Modern design needs to learn anew the lesson of organic unity from natural material life. Jorn himself summed it up as follows in another paper. "The functionalists have defined urbanism as the creation of our framework for living. If this good idea is to be developed further, we must substitute for a rationalist framework an artistic way of working, in which all branches of art cooperate in an organic art of unity." This, of course, was in a way what Schwitters attempted to do in uniting painting, sculpture, and architecture in the Märzbau. Looked at in another way, Jorn's underlying claim was that the framework for living was not one that could be imposed from outside externally by city planners and architects. It had to be built in cooperation with the inhabitants of the city themselves, whose free input was needed, just as the skeleton needed the muscles and the stalk needed the sap. In this way, a critique of Corbusier developed into a theory of what the Situationists called unitary urbanism, which itself developed in time into a critique of the totality of capitalist society, which in turn led to the political doctrines of councilist democracy and workers' control, which characterized the uprising of May 1968. The focus for Situationist thought, of course, was Paris. Paris was the city in which they lived, aspects of which they both loved and hated, and Paris was the city where the barricades went up in May 1968. The Situationists, paradoxically, combined a revolutionary concern, even a utopian concern, to create an entirely new Paris of the future, with a strong conservationist streak, endlessly condemning the destruction of old streets and quarters and protesting against the bureaucratic modernization of the city. For instance, the destruction of the Rue Sauvage in the 13th arrondissement was specifically mourned in Potlatch. Later, the destruction of the old market area around Les Halles to create a shopping centre and an art museum was fiercely attacked by Guy Debord. When I co-organized the Situationist exhibition at the Beaubourg, Debord indicated that he would not be able to attend because he had sworn never to set foot in that building. First, it bore the hated name of Pompidou, the accursed foe of 1968. And second, it was the poisoned fruit of the destruction of the previous huddle of streets, cafes, and life as it should be lived beloved by Debord and his comrades. A number of other areas of Paris, on the other hand, were singled out for positive attention. Arrondissement 7 was favorably invoked. That's the district around and behind Les Invalides. The square des Missions Étrangères, near the junction of Rue de Babylone and Boulevard Raspail, was specifically recommended. 36 Rue des Morillons was praised. This could be the abattoir, according to my map. I've always meant to tour these sites to check them out, these and other situationist locations, but sadly, I have never yet done so. In fact, it would be relatively easy to carry out a situationist tour of Paris because Debord's two folding maps of the city specifically pick out the areas worth wandering in and indicate with bright red arrows possible directions for taxi journeys rapidly between them through the areas not worth paying any attention to. Areas of the city suggested for special research were the Butte aux Cailles near the Place d'Italie, the continent of Contrescarpe, presumably the area around the Place Contrescarpe, the Morgue, Aubervilliers, a grim area just outside the city limits to the north, and the Désert de Retz. In this sense, we can see that the apparent call made by the situationists for total revolution needs to be somewhat nuanced. While social relations should be totally transformed, the best of the past should be honored and preserved. In fact, in many of Debord's texts, there is a strongly elegiac note and an intense involvement with the past, not only its great struggles and failed revolutions, but also its literature and its monuments. A brief word on psychogeography, the field of research which guided the situationists in their appraisal of the city and its architecture. It's first introduced into situationist discourse by Guy Debord in the following way, quote, "The word psychogeography, suggested by an illiterate Kabyle as a general term for the phenomena a few of us were investigating around the summer of 1953, is not too inappropriate. Psychogeography can set for itself the study of the precise laws and the specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of individuals. The adjective psychogeographical, retaining a rather pleasing vagueness, can thus be applied to the findings arrived at by this type of investigation, to their influence on human feelings, and even more generally, to any situation or conduct that seems to reflect the same spirit of discovery." Then follows an example in the form of a question. It's long been said that the desert is monotheistic. Is it illogical or devoid of interest to observe that the district in Paris between Place de la Contrescarpe and Rue de la Bellette, the continent of Contrescarpe, I presume again, conduces rather to atheism, to oblivion, and to the disorientation of habitual reflexes? At this relatively early stage of situationist thought, the principal idea was simply to make delirious proposals with as much seductive power as possible, with the long-term aim of transforming, quote, the whole of life into an exciting game. The play principle before the work principle. Homo ludens, in Heisinger's words, before man as thinker or worker. Chirico's arcades could perhaps, they thought, be models for a whole new city architecture. Claude Lorrain's paintings of harbours at dusk, said Debord, have a strange beauty, not a plastic beauty. The new beauty can only be a beauty of situation, but simply the particularly moving presentation in both cases of a sum of possibilities. Thus, from the start, psychogeography was bound up with the creation of situations, and the concept of situations was expanded in time to cover not just the city, but the whole of society, the totality of possibilities open, ideally, in an unalienated community. Debord goes on to broach some further practical projects, however. For instance, he suggests, all the equestrian statues in Paris could be taken down and reassembled somewhere in the middle of the Sahara Desert, arranged as if for an artificial cavalry charge. Not just all the statues in Paris, in fact, but all the statues in all the cities of the world. The new ensemble should be dedicated to the memory of the greatest massacrers of history, from Tamburlaine to General Ridgway. Here, Debord concludes, we see reappear one of the main demands of our generation, educational value. In the city itself, a new awareness of the emotional atmospheric effect of streets would make it possible to create exciting new varieties of emotional experience by creating new arrangements of streets and hence new urban decors in a way analogous to the blending of pure chemicals in an infinite number of mixtures. Ed van der Elsken's book of photographs, Love on the Left Bank, gives us a fascinating insight into the life actually lived in Paris by the future situationists and their milieu, then still rebel lettrists or imaginists. The central character of the book, a Mexican, whose point of view the photographer seems to take, has arrived in Paris as a hitchhiker, another form of nomad, sleeping out on benches. Soon he makes some new friends and wanders from cafe to cafe with an Australian girl in search of the scene. The book consists mainly of photographs taken in left bank cafes, specific milieus, portraits of their denizens, napping, embracing, drinking, putting money in the jukebox, playing chess, whispering, selling hashish, reading psychology textbooks, acting as nightclub guides for tourists, begging, playing the guitar, handing out publicity leaflets in the street, painting, grinning, eating cheese sandwiches, sleeping in news cinemas or the metro, arguing, singing, smoking hashish, flirting, getting drunk, picking a fight, dancing, making up, listening to music, just waiting, being sent to jail, dreaming, falling in love. Finally, he returns to Mexico, the repertory of urban experiences exhausted. In fact, it's a very confined life, limited by lack of money and, I suppose, lack of focus, if that's the right word. In the photographs, it seems to be dark all the time. Who knows what happens in the daylight? It's the same world, or at least an overlapping world, with the one which Guy Debord celebrated in his film On the Passage of Rather a Few People Through a Brief Enough Period of Time, made in 1959, also a kind of documentary, but an avant-garde documentary, made 2 or 3 years after Van Elsken's book. In Van Elsken's book, a lot of the people you see in the photographs were actually future members of the Situationist International. Already, a lot has changed. Debord begins by invoking the architecture of the quarter, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, on the left bank. In tall buildings lining the streets live the ordinary, nondescript inhabitants, the petite bourgeoisie, buildings designed to shelter them from all the street life down below. The people below, the young people, for instance, whom we saw in Van der Elsken's book, are members of a kind of provisional micro-society. They are on the margins of the economy. They are consumers rather than producers. Above all, they are consuming their own time, in fact, their own free time, Debord adds. Life doesn't change very much. They go back to the same places over and over again. No one ever wants to go to sleep. They're looking for a way out. They're lost, perhaps, in a kind of labyrinth. They have no real sense of the future. They will never again be so free. Everything seems impermanent, including relationships. Their freedom is really only a dream. Their sense of play is inherently unstable. Any moment, everyday life will reclaim its rights. The game they play has strict spatial limits imposed upon it. Outside their little area, there is a whole city in which you would never meet anyone you know. Sometimes the police come and take people away, perhaps to an institution, perhaps to return them to their detested families. At least these people, the subjects of the film, are aware of the inadequacies of the confining area in which they live. They, now Deboer switches to we, want to find another way of using the urban landscape. They want to find new passions. The atmosphere of the places they frequent makes them feel the potential power of an architecture which has still to be created, its power to provide a basis and a framework for less pointless games. The present urban environment simply proclaims, with violence, the requirements and the tastes of the dominant society. Everything has to be changed. Here the screen goes blank. Tabula rasa. What is interesting about Deboer's film is the way in which the call for revolution follows directly from a critique of spatiality and architecture. It's as if architecture is the point where the hidden power of the dominant society imposes itself most directly, and yet in a way which usually goes quite unnoticed. It's at this point we can begin to see how the critique of city architecture, the project of a unitary urbanism, could have been transformed into a call for social revolution. Deboer begins with a marginal micro-society outside the world of everyday work and everyday life, scraping by, street selling, stealing, and then goes on to analyze the way in which, although they all dream of leaving, going back to Mexico, so to speak, they're really trapped in their little area. The only way out is the police van. They're trapped not simply because of their own lack of vision, although this is part of the story, but also because of the spatial fragmentation demanded by society. Its segregation into different micro-societies which never really meet. Hence the project of unitary urbanism, which itself is then seen to imply social revolution. Society as a whole, totalized society, has to be transformed before particular micro-societies can fully recreate themselves. When the revolution came, or nearly came, or scarcely came, depending on how you look at it, and the micro-society broke out of its limits in May 1968, when retotalization seemed, amazingly, to be on the agenda, it nonetheless failed. Perhaps the only practical project which remained was the White Bicycles project in Amsterdam, organized by the provos, for whom Constant, who I mentioned earlier, was an important source of ideas. White bicycles could be ridden by anyone, left in the street when the journey was over, and then picked up by someone else to use for another journey, and so on. Free, spontaneous transport anywhere in the city. It resembles the idea of the Dérive, rather than that of unitary urbanism, but for a short while, as long as there was goodwill, it seemed to work. Perhaps it was the nearest the Situationists came in practice to changing the urban environment. The main activity of May 68, however, was the promotion of occupations, and most celebrated of all, the painting of graffiti. Occupations changed the relations of power temporarily, but they didn't change the architecture. Graffiti entered the popular memory, but in the end they were scrubbed off the walls. The Situationists' wilder projects for Détournement never really took off. In Potlatch, there had been any number of visionary proposals. The metro should be kept running all night. Special aerial runways with ladders and things should be constructed to facilitate journeys across the rooftops. Churches should be turned into children's playgrounds, or alternatively, chambers of horror. Railway stations should be left exactly as they are, with no changes at all, except that all timetables and detailed travel information should be removed from them. Graveyards should be abolished. Prisons should be opened. Street names, of course, should be changed. And all museums should be shut, and the artworks distributed to be hung in bars and Arab cafes. Détournement had already been outlined as a strategy in a magazine called Les Lèvres Nues, Bare Lips, back in May 1956, in an article on its methods co-written by Guy Debord and Gil Wolman. Essentially, the idea was something like Bertolt Brecht's concept of refunctioning. In fact, Brecht is cited positively in the article on the subject of making changes to the classics to refunction them. So perhaps there was a direct connection. The two basic ideas underlying Détournement were those of recontextualization and active plagiarism. The article is mainly about literary refunctioning, inserting passages from one text into another in order to change their meaning and effect, creating new unexpected meanings by juxtaposing well-known passages from famous books in a surprising way, changing the sense of existing texts by plagiarizing them while making a series of word changes, and so on. But there are also sections on film, the power of montage, and architecture. Quote, to the extent that new architecture must apparently begin with an experimental Baroque stage, the architectural complex, which we conceive as the construction of a dynamic environment related to styles of behavior, will probably refunction existing architectural forms, and in any case will make plastic and emotional use of all sorts of refunctioned objects, calculatedly arranged cranes or metal scaffolding replacing a defunct sculptural tradition. This is shocking only to the most fanatical admirers of classic French gardens. On the scale of the city, Debord and Wollen outlined an ambitious plan for transferring whole neighborhoods from one city to another and inserting them exactly as they were into their place in the new city. Quote, life can never be too disorienting. Refunctioning on this level would really make it beautiful. Sometime later, Pino Galizio developed his plan for industrial painting, in effect a refunctioning both of painting and the assembly line by yoking the two together. He devised a kind of Heath Robinson machine which, using industrial paints, could cover rolls of canvas fed through it with arbitrary spatters of paint. In some ways, of course, it was intended as a conceptual refunctioning, parodic refunctioning of Jackson Pollock, inserting his style of painting into an absurd industrial context. Pino Galizio then developed the idea further by suggesting that immense rolls of this industrial painting could be used as the road surfaces for all the autostrada in Italy, until Italy's motorways were entirely paved with pseudo-abstract expressionism made by Pino Galizio's machine. More modestly, Pino Galizio actually constructed a cavern of antimatter out of his industrial paintings, which formed the walls and the ceilings and the floor, creating a cavern or grotto which was entirely made of paintings, entirely man-made, or rather machine-made, an entire painterly environment. I found it a very strange experience standing there in it when it was reconstructed in the Beaubourg, of all places, after Galizio's son had found the original rolls stored away in a cellar. I felt there'd been a refunctioning of painting, not simply as architecture, but even as nature, as the cavern walls sagged and seemed to be covered with some strange deposit about to crumble or drip. Constance's New Babylon project, on the other hand, the most ambitious attempt to envisage the possible implications of unitary urbanism, seemed completely futuristic and even rationalist in a way, if I dare use the term in this context. The title, New Babylon, was taken from Kozintsev and Trauberg's post-revolutionary film made in Russia in the 1920s about the Paris Commune. Thus, Constance's name for his utopian city already invoked two revolutions, one in Petersburg, the other in Paris. Constance's visionary city was essentially linear and seemed to be designed primarily for a nomadic population, albeit perhaps one of millions. Helicopters and aircraft of the future could arrive at landing pads, and travelers could stay there as long as they liked before leaving again, proceeding on what I suppose was imagined as a kind of futuristic interurban aerial dérive. While in New Babylon, however, the inhabitants could democratically decide exactly how to allocate the structure's space, since all the walls were movable at the touch of a switch. Similarly, the internal climate was completely controlled. Anything could be ordered up by the inhabitants, from sauna to snowstorm. New Babylon, in fact, combined features of council communism or workers' control, only with travelers rather than workers, since everything was automated, with a commitment to transience and a confident vision of the power of technology and its potential for liberating people, if democratically used. In fact, Constant's project seems much more plausible now as we read about intelligent heating systems and so on, than it did back at the time when it was first conceived, 40 years or so ago. Of all the futurist cities devised in that period, and there were a great many, I still find Constance the most fascinating. Aware, of course, of the critique of architecture made by his colleagues, he took care to build the inhabitants into his project as democratic controllers of its practical form, changing it day by day to suit their own needs, or, I guess, in psychogeographical terms, changing it day by day to suit their own desires to experience new emotional states. He even allowed for the programming by the inhabitants of colored light and perfumes in each room. At the same time, following Pino Galizia's lead, he envisaged the inhabitants as a kind of society of gypsies, nomads who moved whenever and wherever their fancy took them, traveling, I presume, for free, as if futuristic aircraft were like the white bicycles which Constant later promoted. The plastic models were also designed to be both architectural and sculptural, exhibited in art galleries as sculpture, while actually architectural models of the New Babylon project, to work as aesthetic objects in their own right, as well as intimations of future cities. Constant, however, seems to have abandoned altogether the wish to retain the already existing cities we still have today, or even elements of them. He worked with a tabula rasa. Perhaps he imagined that the cities we live in now had all been destroyed in some kind of catastrophe, or perhaps they'd been burned to the ground in a mass uprising, a kind of global Watts riots. The Situationists, of course, welcomed the Watts riots when they occurred in mid-60s Los Angeles. They were evoked again recently by two expelled ex-Situationists, T.J. Clark and Donald Nicholson Smith, as a welcome revolutionary model. There seems a difference, however, between destroying your environment and transforming it, however great the pressure under which you act. There is something eerie about the absence of the past in Constant's New Babylon, a sense somehow that the concept of the new has been taken too far as polar opposite of the old, a long way further than Debord was willing to take it. Guy Debord identified himself with Lacenaire, the assassin dandy in Marcel Carné's great film Les Enfants du Paradis, The Children of the Gods. Leaving aside Debord's identification with a figure which Mary Joyce has described as that of the dandy outlaw, I was struck once again by the nostalgia for a vanished Paris, one in which an unalienated crowd thronged through the streets and enjoyed a spectacle, the mime, which spoke both from and to their condition. Recently, thinking about what kind of architecture the Situationists might be interested in today, I found myself faced with a problem. Hadn't architecture definitively become part of the spectacle, at least in its most publicly recognized forms? Spectacular office blocks in London or Kuala Lumpur, spectacular museums in Los Angeles or Bilbao, spectacular new airports in Tokyo or Hong Kong. Perhaps it should all be razed to the ground after all. Only the classics should be preserved. On the other hand, there were new types of architecture which had emerged elsewhere in the very same society. I thought of Margaret Morton's project, The Architecture of Despair, sections of which have been published in Diana Balmori and Margaret Morton's book, Transitory Gardens, Uprooted Lives, published by Yale University Press in 1993. This is a book about the little gardens created and nurtured lovingly by homeless people on the desolate ground where they have built their makeshift huts in New York City. Or there is another similar project, Anthony Hernandez's Landscapes of Despair, published by the Sprengel Museum in Hanover in 1995, another photographic study of the abject and transitory dwellings of the homeless, this time in Los Angeles, located mainly in the wilderness which runs along both sides of the freeways. These are the outsider architects of today. As for Deboer's own attitude, I was struck how in his last film he quotes from Nicholas Ray's movie Johnny Guitar, specifically, plagiarizes of course, specifically the scene where the outlaw figure, a traveling musician, a nomad, a wanderer, Johnny Guitar himself, played by Sterling Hayden, shows up unexpectedly at Vienna's Place, a saloon and gambling house in the middle of nowhere, owned and run by a former lover, Vienna, played by Joan Crawford. It's as if the nomad has to stop wandering in the end, to try and come home at last, as happens in all of Nicholas Ray's films, however alien it may seem. Of course, it's a doomed hope. Vienna's Place is burned to the ground by an angry lynch mob. There's no option. The nomadic life is the only one there is. Perhaps in the end, Deboer's view of architecture was a tragic view, that there was no grand solution, that you were fated to play the role of the wandering outlaw. But this was, after all, the most honourable role there was. Vienna's Place was the dreamed-of home, but in the end it had to go up in flames, just as the May events had to end in failure. Still, there was little to regret, and much in elegiac mood to be proud of. I want to end, however, on a more optimistic note. In 1973, a book was published in Turin on Asger Jorn's garden at Albisola in North Italy, near the Mediterranean coast. Basically, Jorn, before his death, had transposed a group of vernacular buildings overlooking the sea in a small village by turning them into a kind of ceramic garden with painted sculptures, mosaic tiles, murals of found materials and so on, together, of course, with beds and pots of flowers, real flowers, nature. Guy Debord wrote an essay for the book titled On Wild Architecture. He began by reminding us that the Situationists had once called for the construction of new types of city, environments favourable to the expression of countless new passions. Naturally, he continued, this wasn't very easy to achieve, and as a result, the Situationists felt compelled to try and achieve another goal, one which in fact was even harder to carry through. As a result, all their projects had to be abandoned, and their great capacities, as he puts it, were wasted, as happens to many hundreds of millions of others. Debord then turns to consider Jorn's outsider garden. He reminisces his piece of wild architecture. He reminisces about Asger Jorn and about the importance of the role in the history of the Situationist International, how much of their thinking came from Jorn, how Jorn always found the money through selling paintings when the printer was refusing to print the next issue of the magazine. He recollects how Jorn, as is often forgotten, was one of the very first to develop, quote, a modern critique of the most recent forms of repressive architecture. In Albisola, he continues, Jorn showed that whatever our failures on the grand scale, each of us can appropriate our own space, make the world in a small way what we desire it to be. Out of what might seem at first to be a chaos of debris and odds and ends, Jorn had succeeded in making a complex and unified work. The words complex and unified are those of Guy Debord. For those who remember the passionate conflicts there have been between situationists and architecture, Debord reminds us, Albisola can be seen as a kind of inverse Pompeii, his phrase, the outlines of a city which has not yet been born, as though potentially the great catastrophe which buried Pompeii, which was set in the past, is now one, which is set in the future, I guess. It had been a collaborative work, Debord points out, which provided at least an insight into the forms of, quote, collective play, which could alone put an end to the separation, in his words, between culture and everyday life, typical of our society. Debord went on to invoke, once again after so many long years, the example of the postman Cheval, who built a monumental architecture entirely on his own, and the King of Bavaria, who had done the same with much greater means. Jorn had shown what could be done with, quote, just a little time, a little luck, enough good health, just enough money, some thought, and also some good humour. The situationists, Debord finally ended up noting, had badly needed reserves of good humour, given the scandal and opprobrium which they created. To those who ask pointlessly whether it wouldn't have been better for everyone if the situationists had never existed, he suggests another question. Wouldn't it have been better to give them 2 or 3 towns to reconstruct, instead of frustrating them to the point where they tried to overthrow society? But others might explain that the result would, after all, have been just the same. Trying to buy them off with new towns to create would simply have whetted their insatiable appetite for change, he concludes. That's it. My Dérive has come to an end. Thank you. Sure, try it. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any questions?
Oh yeah. Did I have any theories about the reasons for Guy Debord's suicide? I don't really want to speculate about that. He may well have been in bad health. Certainly, I've mentioned a lot how, as time went on, he actually became increasingly elegiac and looking back to the past, and was increasingly demoralized by what he saw happening in modern society. I mean, globalization and all that, things were much worse than in the 60s, he must have felt. What combination of those things, or which one of them, or whatever, I just don't know at all. Yeah, I don't think it's become part of the establishment. I think that's slightly overstating your case. Actually, it's dead, rather than being part of the establishment. I mean, I think there's an enormous amount that you could learn from it if you want to, and some of those things I tried to indicate. I think you can learn, as I said, that with a little money and a little luck and a little good health, you can still do things despite the massive pressures of the organized society around you. I think you can learn that it's important to keep the instinct for revolt to the end. I think you can think about many of the issues which the Situationists raised, and which I tried to give a hint of in this, talk. All those things. And I don't think those would lead you into the establishment if you followed those precepts. What? Yeah. Not on the contrary. I mean, as I said, Guy Debord himself was always well aware that there's much to learn from things, the past. There's much to learn from looking back. There's much to learn from looking at things that were dead and things that were failures. There's much to learn from looking at 68. There's much to learn from looking at the Paris Commune. There's much to learn, looking at many such historical events. There was much to learn for Debord in reading, as he did towards the end of his life, the Greek historians. I recommend them. Probably because I forgot about it. Do you have a comment you'd like to make about it? Yeah. No, I agree with you. I mean, I guess I got sort of, it was a Dérive, and I didn't pass through that neighborhood somehow. But you're right. It's well worth rereading.
You mentioned that these situations in Paris.
Yeah.
All their ideas grow out of Paris, but they call themselves the Situationist International.
Yeah.
And there were actually a breakaway group in 1962 where the whole movement was split into two. And painters, the artists, all left the theorists behind in Paris. But they'd all been there in the beginning.
Yeah.
What is there no role in your history of the Situationists? The German artists, the Spur group, the Bauhaus Situationists in Scandinavia. And you mentioned Constant as yes, he writes in French. But you mentioned him as a Belgian artist. Do you think the fact that you mentioned him as a Belgian artist is actually a Dutch artist?
Did I say Belgian? I know he's Dutch.
Yeah, well you did.
Yeah. Sorry.
I was wondering if that was a
Yeah.
slip.
It was a slip.
It's bringing him closer to Paris.
Yeah.
There is this is from Cobra, the Cobra group, and the image of this Bauhaus in the years coming up. It's the foundation of Situationists, which seems to be missing from your thesis, which is concentration on hot flash and the international lecturers.
Well, I don't entirely agree, actually, because the main spring of what I was saying actually comes from Asger Jorn, who...
Yeah, but you call him, you place him within the concentration situations, which is true.
I didn't actually. Everything which I quoted, was before the...
Yeah, but you called Hal Heston.
Yeah.
Yours,
It wasn't Hal Heston. Yeah.
You dismiss this as obscure. Do you think this is a problem with the situation? Because there are two histories that are in existence, and only one of them is actually coming out. And yet the situation is treated as an ideological whole that people can write about and talk about in a particular way. But it's the neglect of a large part of the movement. There were 140 members of the group
Yeah.
at different times, but it was like a
You know, I'm actually rather sympathetic to the Second International and the splitists. But, I mean, if you look at, say, Jürgen Nash or people, I don't think there's the same amount to say about urbanism and architecture as there was coming from the people who I talked about. I mean, there's a certain amount of, you know, I suppose the chopping the head off the Little Mermaid in Copenhagen Harbour could be construed as a kind of anti-urbanistic act or something, you know, but
But that was part of a much greater extent than we know really about it. There is the concept.
yeah, but those were like what they developed. Yeah, what they developed was what you might call the festive side of the.
Well, that's what's called.
Yeah, but I think that's true. I do. Yeah. The spur group started gravitating off towards terrorism as well. Yeah, I know, but I'm just. You,
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Not to my knowledge, I don't think so. I know. Do you know that? What? Okay. Okay, thank you. So that's the answer to that question. But I think the original impetus for both of them, you know, was separate, and then they later met, right? But they were, I mean, there was a whole lot of these kind of utopian futuristic schemes at that time. I think it was something fairly general, and Constant gave a particular inflection to his because of his background with Cobra and with the Situationists. A different sense, yeah. Yeah.
Question here.
Yeah.
Deserto.
Was Deserto linked to the Situationists? I mean, I have absolutely no idea. I mean, I imagine that, you know, a lot of the ideas of the Situationists are in common currency, you know, particularly in France. So, but whether there were links, I'd be surprised, actually. I've never heard of that, but it could be. Absolutely, in the early... well, actually, it's more likely it would come through Lefebvre directly rather than through the Situationists, yeah. Debord picked up quite a bit from Lefebvre. Well, yeah, Jürgen Nash. So Jürgen Nash lives in the countryside in a sort of farmhouse place. Debord went to the, you know, at the end of his life went to the country. Otherwise, I think, you know, during the formative years, it was very urban as a movement. Although, again, the Italians lived in, you know, Pino Galizio came, although he was back and forth with Turin and Milan and so on, lived in a small town. And then there was the gypsies, that side of it.
Are there any other?
How do you think the Situationists feel if they knew that there's lectures
I think they'd feel it was inevitable. They'd find it both depressing and hilarious in some way.
But also the surviving situationists who were involved with the show you organised seemed rather pleased.
Oh, well, they were pleased because they thought they'd just been forgotten. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, but most of them came from the Second International. They were the ones who were still, in some sense, active, if that's the word. Certainly, they were great drinkers. J.V. Martin pulled out a gun at the opening at the Boburg. Every exhibition organizer's nightmare. Wanted to shoot people.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, on your behalf, I'd like to thank Peter for incredibly good lecture and also putting up with, I think, the oddest set of questions since Mastermind. Thank you.
Thank you.